Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And in this one, the time is finally here where I will be ranking the melee DPS specializations for World of Warcraft moving into Shadowlands. Now, do take note that this tier list is based off of likely more of a subjective opinion than an objective one. If you're looking for performance and what is parsing the highest, this will take that into account, but it's not the main focus of it. The main focus of it is how fun, engaging, and long-lasting is it going to be to play this specialization? Am I going to enjoy playing an Arms Warrior for 5 months and on from that point? Because from my perspective for Shadowlands is that you're going to be making a pretty big investment in whatever you pick to play. So you want to make sure that it's something that will keep you entertained for that long period of time. Now, just because my subjective opinion of what is fun and engaging for a long period of time may be different than somebody else's, I'm also going to be taking that into account when I am ranking them here on the tier list. So to start things off right off the bat, we've got the Arms Warrior. This is a specialization that I've got my eyes glued to because it has a lot of the core utility that was removed from the spec being brought back. Spell Reflection Baseline, Intervene. In PvE, you may not care, although I do think that these spells will have a place to the creative players that decide to utilize them, especially in Mythic Plus to try and get around certain affixes like Necrotic. If you intervene a couple of melee hits and reduce the stacks of Necrotic, you could enable your tank in dungeons to do very effectively. And overall, I think it's going to be a spec that is fun in raids, dungeons, PvP, and solo content, as a lot of sustain is being brought to the spec with some talents being buffed up for self-healing. So to me, overall, as a spec, I think it's got a lot of depth. I think it's still got a little bit of that spin to win flavor to it for simplicity. And it then also has the option for this huge amount of utility, which is why I'm putting Arms Warrior on the S tier. Do note, if tuning is off and Arms Warrior doesn't do competitive damage, and that's all you care about, maybe that opinion that I'm bringing to the Arms Warrior doesn't matter to you. But this is a spec that I'm looking at for personally myself that I could play for a very long time in Shadowlands and still enjoy playing it. The next specialization we've got here is the Assassination Rogue. So in my mind, I feel like Assassination Rogue kind of gets the raps of being the simpler rogue spec, and this is maybe more of a PvP biased opinion than a PvE biased one. Its performance has been about average, I would say, in PvE throughout Battle for Azeroth. In PvP, it's been the #1 top performer for its consistent pressure and the mortal wounds effect that it brings. It still has all of that coming back. It has new combo point spenders like Slice and Dice, so you'll have a little bit more management that you were lacking. They have a conduit coming back that I would rank as the strongest conduit, especially when it comes to endurance conduits in the game for PvP purposes. This is the healing effect. So when you use Slice and Dice, you apply Recuperate to yourself, which made Rogues and Cataclysm the most bonkers immortal class in the game, which already right there, based on performance, I feel like it's going to be a top performer. It's getting a bit of the utility back that it was it lost, but not so much so as the other specializations because it already had its poisons. But based on how I think that it's going to perform, it's going to do really well. Am I going to enjoy it? I have a lot of time spent on Assassination, and it's not really changing all too much, so I am a bit worried that I would get bored of it. But if it's a spec that you want to play to win, in PvP, I don't see why it wouldn't be the case. In PvE, I think Outlaw probably comes out ahead in Mythic Plus circumstances as it did for Battle for Azeroth. You just can't compete with Blade Flurry. And then in raids, it's just entirely up to whatever the numbers are tuned to, as most of that engagement is going to be single target, sustained damage. So for me, Assassination Rogue is kind of an A tier. I'm a bit worried that I personally will get bored of it because I've played it quite a lot throughout Legion and Battle for Azeroth. I don't think enough is changing about it that I'm immediately thinking that I'll play it for a really long time. But if you're new to the spec, it still will have a lot of depth to it for you to explore. So it's still ranked up high there. My personal bias is coming in, so it falls down to A instead of S. Enhancement Shaman now is a spec that has been getting a lot of attention. It's got a rework, and then they had another rework just recently. It's been getting a lot of attention. They're trying to bring it back to an older playstyle of enhancement, which I really like. It's got a lot of the extra utility with most of their totems coming back and weapon imbuements coming back. So I'm very curious to see how it ends up working out. It is a specialization in the past that I've had a lot of fun playing for a long period of time. So bringing back that old utility is definitely going to make a strong argument for myself to continue playing it. Also, with all of the changes to it in terms of its AoE potential, that's where I feel like the most attention has been put into the spec. Means that it seems like they're trying really hard to make it competitive for Mythic Plus. So if that was a concern for you, is that you never got into a group as enhancement for BFA, it at least on the surface appears like they are trying their best to make it competitive in that environment and make it maybe a bit more spin to win. So it's got the utility, it's got that hybrid role, it's got an interesting rotation with dot management. I'm ranking Enhancement Shaman as S tier in terms of I think that I can play this spec for all of Shadowlands, not get incredibly bored of it and want to stop playing it, thanks to some of the changes that they've made to the spec. Feral Druid is getting some old school additions, like Heart of the Wild, and I'm a bit interested to see how it plays out. If, to me, what they've tried to do with the Druid is bring back the idea that you're a shapeshifter. So if you want to fulfill another role as an off tank, or you want to heal for a little bit, you can do it. Now, will that actually happen in top tier raid performance or top tier Mythic Plus? I feel like it would be unlikely. If you're ever in a position where you need to be a second tank or a second healer, then maybe your tank or your healer is not performing adequately. Not a lot of the spec is changing other than getting Cyclone baseline if we're looking at PvP utility. So if you've played Feral Druid a lot in Battle for Azeroth, you'll likely still enjoy it. For myself, I haven't explored Feral Druid very much, so I would still rank it pretty high in terms of I feel like I could play this spec and not get bored of it. I'm interested to try some different combinations with Covenants, like Convoke the Spirits and Heart of the Wild, see if I get a huge boost of healing during that time. So I think it is a spec similarly to the Assassination Rogue, where it's got a skill cap. I'm a bit worried that not enough is changing from Battle for Azeroth to Shadowlands, unlike for Arms Warrior and Enhancement, so it goes a little bit lower for me personally. But it's still up there in terms of its depth and its playstyle. Frost Death Knight. This is clearly one of those specs that's kind of spin to win. Frost is sold on its simplicity. For me, that can be dangerous. Because I will just eventually become numb, and that's not a pun because it's Frost. I will eventually become numb to a playstyle that's just purely AoE damage, spin to win, but you might not. So take that into account. If you want something that's just, I'm going to jump down into these dungeons, I'm going to grind a bunch of monsters down, it seems like the spec is being built in a way that it will be able to achieve that. For myself personally, I'm not sold that it has enough utility in PvP for my own personal interests, but in raids, if you want to be part of that cooldown squad, where your raid leader will rotate cooldowns during a bursty mechanic for a boss with anti-magic zone coming back baseline, you'll get to be a part of that process. If that's something that interests you for the Death Knight, then definitely take it into consideration. But for myself personally, it's a little bit too spin to win and too simple for myself, but if it isn't for you, it may be ranked higher, but I'm still giving it a slightly lower rank in terms of I don't feel like I'll be able to play this for the entire expansion without getting bored. Now we've got Fury Warrior. This is also kind of the spin to win specialization, but they do get the same types of utility returning to them as Arms Warrior with Intervene and Spell Reflect. The main downside of Fury Warrior when it comes to PvE is always just tuning, right? Does it do more damage than Arms? And that's usually all it comes down to. Does it do more damage than Arms? If it doesn't, then everyone's playing Arms. If it does, then everyone's playing Fury. It's really not that hard to decide in PvE as to whether or not why one of these specs is being picked over the other. It's just purely a numbers game. But in PvP, the main differentiating factor is that Arms can reduce healing effects with mortal wounds, and Fury can't. Fury's staple has been burst damage, heavy hitting burst damage, or healing itself to try and have an identity over Arms Warrior, which it's still going to hold pretty true. So I am curious to see how it ultimately plays out for Fury compared to Arms, but I'm a bit worried that it's still a little bit too spin to win. It has a slightly less utility and interaction than Arms does in PvP. And then in PvE, It is just a numbers game. So I'm giving Fury Warrior a little bit lower of a rank in terms of my own personal interest. But if you're somebody who does like jumping into dungeons, doing the spin to win, and just getting that immediate feel and sensation of the Fury Warrior, then it should still be a spec that you want to go to personally. But for myself, it's a little bit too simple. Also take into to account Torghast, something that I've not even spoken about. So things like Fury Warrior with sustainability and frost will be really good in Torghast as a solo player. So if you were more interested in just Torghast, then these specializations will get a higher rank. I've got a slight PvP bias, but I do play the game overall, so take that into account. Havoc Demon Hunter is another one that's somewhat is spin to win. It's really not getting a lot brought to it. It seems like they're trying to force different builds on it, even though the Demonic Eye Beam, I think, is, from my opinion, is the most fun build. Activating the Eye Beam, blasting down targets, switching into Metamorphosis. That idea, the whole idea of transforming like that is fun, but they're forcing a couple of other playstyles onto it that are already pretty much existing on other specializations. It's not exactly unique to the Havoc Demon Hunter. It's more or less the same. I've played it a lot in Battle for Azeroth. I've done the most amount of visions on Demon Hunter. I've PvP'd to Gladiator level on Demon Hunter. I do my Mythic Pluses on Demon Hunter. It's a top performer, but I am bored. I am just, and not enough of it is changing, and the build that likely is being forced to be played is really interesting to me enough to keep wanting to play it. But if you were going to do Torghast, you wanted to solo Torghast and perform well, it's a spec that it's really hard for it not to do well, I feel like. So it's going to seem weird with me putting it here on the C tier with my own personal bias, and likely its performance output is going to be incredible. So on a tier list that's just, this is the best for Mythic Plus, it does insane damage, it's going to be at the top. But for myself, I'm personally tired of it. Not enough is changing, and the stuff that is changing to something that's still just not that interesting to me. So it's getting a lower rank in terms of I will want to log in every day and play my Demon Hunter. Outlaw Rogue is getting a lot of its RNG kind of distributed out of the rotation and into cooldowns, with Roll to Bones becoming a 45-second cooldown that you still gamble, but it's not integral to the damage rotation, so you'll still feel a nice flow on the spec. It still has Blade Flurry, even though the AoE cleave is being capped down to a limited number of targets, so you're not going to pull the whole dungeon and blast away it with Blade Flurry. You're still going to be competing in the same numbers field likely as all the other AoE classes. So I would find it hard to believe that it's not still a top performer in Mythic Plus, as that's just generally the case. You do good AoE damage, you're good in Mythic Plus, with some amount of survivability and defensive managements, which it has with Cheat Death. So it's going to be a top performer no matter what. In PvP, it runs the risk of not being a top performer because it competes directly with Subtlety. And what I mean by that is it is burst damage and stun lock. Subtlety generally either has more burst damage or more frequent opportunities at burst damage, and the same amount, if not more, crowd control. So Subtlety almost always outweighs Outlaw. The only times that I ever really see Outlaw being good in the past from Legion forward is when it has like this really all-in cheesy one-shot, which with their tuning towards PvP, it seems like they're generally pretty good at nipping anything in the butt that can immediately kill you. So Outlaw runs a really big risk of being an underperformer in PvP, which it has already shown its history in Battle for Azeroth. So I have big concerns for the spec. It still has a lot of depth. It still has a lot of fun with unique movement, with grappling hook, but it could, and it's still got a high skill cap in terms of no fight is going to be the same, because you're not going to roll the bones the same in any given fight. And hopefully the way that they end up tuning that for the interactions with your rotations will be dynamic, so you're never playing the same boss twice, really, with the spec. So it still does have depth, and it's still a spec that I think I could play for a long time. My main concern is that the track history of the spec is that it's been an underperformer in PvP. Even if you're a PvE, you're like, what am I talking about? So I am going to be ranking it higher. It's going to be up here, but it's not on the S tier because there's a couple of little personal biases I think that could potentially hold the spec back. But it's still a very complicated spec, and hopefully they get the tuning on it right in terms of trying to manage your buffs with your rotation, so that you're never having the same situation twice in a row with the spec, and that would be completely unique to Outlaw. Retribution Paladin, another spec where if you're a PvEer, this spec is almost just like kind of non-existent. It's just like a meme. In PvP, players like Vanguards make it work, but it's definitely a chore. The arguments that I've heard for the specialization is that it's just pop wings, do damage. There's not enough layers to it. Empowered seals is a point of feedback that a lot of PvP Retribution Paladins would like to see brought back to it. In PvE, we're seeing the return of some Legion playstyles with the Divine Storm Spin to Win playstyle. If you enjoyed that in PvE, it's coming back. It could increase its competitiveness in PvE for Mythic Plus and Raid. It's getting auras back, but it is at the sacrifice of Blessing of Kings and Blessing of Wisdom. So if you want the aura gameplay instead, you can reduce interrupts. You might be getting some value to a group because of that. It's not really gameplay, more or less. You could switch between Concentration Aura for interrupt reductions and then Crusader Aura with a Conduit to reduce fears. You get some gameplay out of it there. The Retribution Aura is just like it's not interesting. Someone in your party dies, you activate wings, you do more damage. That mechanic is, in theory, seemed interesting and unique to the Rep Paladin, but when it actually comes to practicality, it never works. It's a spec that I'm really worried about, being just a builder spender, hodge pop wings in PvP and being a little bit too simple. But if you're someone who likes the spin to win playstyle, you want something that's going to be a little bit more simpler, then it would be ranked higher for you on your list. But for myself, it's definitely more complicated than the Fury Warrior or the Frost Death Knight, which is why I have difficulty putting it here on the B tier. I feel like it's still an A tier spec, but it's not getting up there to the Enhancement Shamans or the Arms Warriors just yet, in terms of like I could play this spec and never be bored of it. Survival Hunter, I would have put this as an S tier spec for Battle for Azeroth. When it comes to PvP, in terms of its utility and its gameplay, you can always be doing something better. There's always a little mind game and a skill cap to the spec with the honor talents and the damage rotation, the way that it works. It's always been an interesting spec. It's been an underperformer in PvE, and this is likely due to the fact that Beast Mastery is just simpler and performs better. So usually when I have to try less hard and my numbers are higher, why would I try harder for numbers that are lower? That's kind of been the holdback for survival, I would say, in Battle for Azeroth. And there's not really anything new for it. Some of the stuff that's being brought back, like Arcane Shot, limits you to having a ranged weapon. It still hasn't been determined whether or not that will end up working or not, or if they'll let you weapon swap, if you would even want to weapon swap. Cool stuff like Trank Shot is coming back, so you'll be able to dispel magic effects. I shouldn't say it's coming back, it already exists, but the ability to dispel magic effects. So in PvE, if you wanted to dispel shields, you can now have that utility. In PvP, similarly, if you wanted to remove effects like Blessing of Protection that you were really limited with in the past, you'll be able to do. The only downside I see of this spec in terms of you enjoying it for, let's say, all of Shadowlands is if you already played it for Battle for Azeroth, because not a lot of it is changing. But if you have limited experience or you really liked the depth of it for Battle for Azeroth, on top of some of the utilities that are being brought back to the specialization, I would say that it is still an S tier in terms of its fun, right? Obviously, like I already explained, numbers and tuning, it wasn't number one over Beast Mastery in Mythic Plus, but I think it is a spec that I could play for a long time and still have fun with it, but it does run the risk of being limited in its performance for reasons that I've already explained. Unholy Death Knight, you're getting the same type of utility back as Frost Death Knight with the Anti-Magic Zone baseline. A couple of legendaries with double Death Grip could be interesting. The Covenant abilities with the Necro Lords to pull the targets close to you and keep them close to you. You're getting a ton of healing. I should have said that about Frost Death Knight too. I think Death Knight and Rogue stand the best chance of being the best in PvP because they are getting so much healing to themselves, and that's what's dictated being the best in PvP in Battle for Azeroth. So using that as the trend, I could see Death Knight and Rogue being incredibly top performers in PvP. In PvE, with your epidemic and disease spreads and AoE potential, you were always top contender in Mythic Plus. And then again, for raids, it was just a numbers game between Frost and Unholy, which one ends up coming out ahead in terms of performance. But is it a spec that I could play for a really long time and still enjoy? I mean, there's probably a reason why I've never really picked up the Death Knight at this point. For a very long period of time. Maybe it's because my friends also play a Death Knight, but I think it's got smooth gameplay. The downside would be that it's got a big ramp, So every time you want to get to your peak moment of damage, you're going to have to go through a long process of empowering your ghouls and activating your gargoyles and getting everything going. But then when you get to the point, you're going to feel really good. It's going to be strong in solo content like Torghast because of its own self-sustainability. Basically, anything I say it's going to be good in PvP, it's probably equally going to be good in solo content for the same reason, because you heal yourself so much, and you won't have to deal with a lot of mechanics because you just can heal through it. So if you want an easier time in that environment, it'll be a spec. I feel like Unholy is not, it's not on an S tier in terms of like, I feel like I could play this spec for the entire expansion and not be bored of it. It's like slightly lower, but if I could break this down in even more tiers, I'd say maybe more than Rets, but less than these three. So maybe just this 5 tier is not enough to bring it in. Fortunately, we don't have anybody that I would never touch. There's nobody on the never touch tier, but yeah, Unholy just doesn't have that little bit of extra layer that I'm personally looking for. It would be slightly simpler than these. And you could also view this tier list as my opinion of more or less of difficulty to play, because for me, I'm looking for something that's challenging, something that also, based on my biased opinion, would be experience. Like, I have less experience playing Outlaw Rogue than Fury Warrior, so maybe that's why I would put it higher, because I've just seen so much of it. But just take that into considerations, that anybody making a tier list like this it's going to be a little bit of personal bias. You should apply your own opinion. If you really want help applying your own opinion for what you want, I also have a playlist for a review of all of the melee specs. So I go into detail. This is more of a summary. I go into detail of everything that they're coming and what you should expect, and then my opinions of them, and that's in the specific reviews. This is more or less just me ranking them, and also trying to help myself pick, like, what am I going to main for this expansion, because it's such a big deal to pick it. But we got 2 specs left here, and they're not last. They are last but not least, except maybe Windwalker in PvE. Subtlety Rogue. This spec is nuts. It's a spec that in PvP revolves around going into stealth, and if the Night Fae Covenant stays the way that it is with Sepsis on top of some conduits to get recuperate back into your class, I see this thing being absolutely owning in PvP. It's been a spec with a high skill cap in terms of setting up your team and communicating in PvP for a long time, and the main downside has been performance. Does it compete with the throughput of Assassination? Well, it's getting the poison effects from Assassination, and it's getting these insane burst window opportunities with legendaries that give you 100% crit. I feel like there's no way that this spec doesn't end up being absolutely insane in PvP, and if it ends up being insane with its already kind of like infinite skill cap, I could see Subtlety Rogue being a spec that I would want to play for a really long time. In PvE, you run the drawback that you don't have Blade Flurry like Outlaw, right? So in PvE, you run a real big risk of being an underperformer, and that will just come down to tuning, which the tier list is not, my tier list here isn't about. This is about fun and engagement. Can I play it for a long time? And I think that it is a spec that I could play for a long time and not get bored of it. I would put Subtlety on the S tier at the moment for my first assessment. And if you really want to know the details, check out those reviews for the specs, playlist down below. And finally, Windwalker Monk. Where are we putting the Windwalker Monk? It's getting Invoke Zwen back. Its Touch of Death is going back to being an execute, but not a lot else is changing. It's still the hit combo gameplay, setting up for Fists of Fury on big AoE pulls. You still got Mystic Touch for 5% physical damage, so you're still going to get a spot in a raid. Still be somewhat desirable depending on what type of damage is top at the start of the expansion, like physical damage, because of that buff. So it should still be a spec that gets a spot. Is it a spec that I feel like I could play for a long time? You've got mobility in PvP. You need to avoid engagements. You've got setup and sustainability. I think it is a spec that I could play for a long time without getting bored. But there's not a lot coming out that's super new and exciting. It's more like the new stuff plays into the stuff it already has, like hit combo builds with the Kyrian Covenant. So unlike Subtlety, which is getting some crazy stuff that's being added to it, I don't know if there's enough to it where I would put it on the same level as the specializations that are interesting me the most at right now. It's still at the top, and it's above Rets, but it's below what I would put it. So if there was another tier, I would do that. Maybe I should rotate everything down another row and then have Demon Hunter. But regardless, this is where we're at. All right, for the melee tier list, based on fun and engagement and longevity. How long can I play the spec before I get bored of it? We got the spin to win tier down here. So if you want to spin to win, you like AoE damage, you're probably going to do well in terms of performance. You're looking for more of a simplistic gameplay. These specs will be more preferential to you, but that's not what I'm looking for. So they're ranked lower. These ones on the middle tier, either not enough is changing about them, or they have some history problems of not being great performers, and I'm concerned about never getting invited to a group, and their engagement level isn't so engaging that I'd be willing to take that risk. But they're not spin to win. They're a little bit above it in terms of their utility and their capability. And then S tier is these specs are getting they were either already really good at their core, like survival and PvP for me, and I think in PvE too. It's just survival had the downside of just not doing as much damage as BM, so you didn't invite it. I didn't mean that it didn't have depth and it wasn't fun to play for a long time. It just didn't have the numbers. So survival already had that. It's getting a couple of things that it didn't that could bring it up in terms of its power level and its skill cap. So it's still, I would still put it as an S tier spec for melee DPS that I could play for the whole expansion. Same thing goes for subtlety. It's a numbers game. It was a spec that was fun to play, but because its numbers didn't compete with Outlaw and Mythic Plus or Assassination and PvP, it was underrated or not invited, or arguably just not good because of that in terms of its performance. But based on its fun and engagement and some cool new build ideas that I've seen for the spec, it's got my interest captivated. Enhancement Shaman's been getting a lot of attention brought back to it. I think that with it going back to more of the older play styles for it, it's going to be an interesting spec to check out. And then Arms Warrior is kind of the same deal. You're getting a whole bunch of that old school utility on top of this rotation that was kind of spin to win, but also just fun at the same time. So now with that utility, you've got the depth that it was lacking, in my opinion, for Battle for Azeroth, more so in PvE and PvP than PvE. And then again, if you care about performance, you just want to be number one. This wasn't the tier list for you in the first place. Hopefully that was made clear at the start of it. This is more or less picking what I think is going to be fun and interesting to explore for the most amount of time in Shadowlands without getting bored. And this is it. We got the tier list. Thank you very much for tuning in. I appreciate it. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of content, as I'm going to be reviewing the healers and releasing a tier list for them now in the future. And aside from that, we'll see you in the next video.